So overall, in what ways do you both think that participating in this human right education through activism help you identify your strengths and weaknesses in work settings?
For me, it was the most influential module out of all of the ones I did at uni, without a doubt.
So I totally agree. I totally agree with you, Heather. It influenced a lot on just me being more aware of my strengths, and it was the most rewarding and the most wonderful module I did my university degree as well. Even though I'm not will continue actively in my working life in human rights itself, I am definitely going to continue in activism and in political education and in working in this field.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Unfiltered by Empowered. I'm your host Anshul Lau. In our podcast, we have conversation with educators from around the world. We uncover the challenges, share their passion, and celebrate the successes. Today, we are joined by two peers, Lily and Hedda, who are both from University of Dundee. They are both graduates. We are thrilled to have them today to share their innovative and insightful work. Welcome to both of you to Unfiltered by Empowered. So, start off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, including any of your key work or anything else you want to share with us and our listeners?
I did a module 2 years ago that we will talk about today, and I'm originally from Germany, so I did it through an Erasmus exchange, and I spent 1 year at the University of Dundee, and now I graduated from my political science program, and I'm currently applying for masters and working at another university as a research assistant, and that is the most things I'm doing right now. I'm also doing some educational activism still on the side, but that's something we can talk about later as well. That's of interest.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, and my name's Hedda, and I am also from the University of Dundee. Although I did my entire degree there, I'm from Sweden originally, but I spent 4 years in Scotland. And in my final year, I did the same module that Lily did, which is the one about human rights activism in a student context that I believe we're going to talk about today. I graduated with a degree in international relations and politics, and my interests are mainly human rights and EU policy. And right now, I'm applying for a number of masters and sort of figuring out a bit what I want to pursue, whilst working a few different jobs back home in Sweden.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for your introduction and good luck, Hedda, for your master's course. And I must give you a background to our listeners that Lily was joined by Edzia, who was a tutor in a module, and Hedda, Lily, and other peers are doing a research project with Edzia, who joined us in a webinar, and also she participated in a podcast. If you want to learn about or know more about the pedagogical side from a tutor's point of view, you should see our another podcast and the link should be in the description. And also, if you want to see the webinar where Lily participated with Edzia, it's a very brief one. You should also find the link for that. We'll proceed on now with the podcast. So, welcome both of you, and thank you for your introduction. So, can you briefly share what initially interested you in activism and what made you do this module particularly?
I think for me, I had zero experience with activism prior to doing that module, but I suddenly had an interest in like the theoretical aspect of human rights, which I'd studied in a few modules previously. So I think what drew me to was that one, it was advertised as an internship, which felt like a neat way to sort of round out my university studies to actually try and apply what I had learned. So that was like initially what drew me to pursue it. But then later I just realized that it was a very well-rounded course, which has been incredibly useful to me, to both figuring out what I want to do in the future, I think, and also who I am in the context of academia, what I'm good at, what I'm not good at, and how to work on that, uh,
Okay.
try and improve it. So
And when you say internship, how was it advertised in along with internship? Was it a paid internship or was it a part of the module?
It was called, the module itself was called Human Rights Advocacy Internship, and it was working together with an NGO called Scholars at Risk, who advocate for academic freedom globally. So, but Edsy is really the heart of it. It's her passion project.
So for this, basically, the internship, you're paid in terms of your assessment and credits. Am I right? There's no money involved. You're not paid.
Yeah. No.
That's perfect. Thank you, Hedda. What about you, Lily?
It's very interesting because I actually came to the module through activism. So I was originally very interested in climate change and society and how that interlinks. And that is connected to a lot of human rights issues. So my main point for pursuing that was my interest in activism, then also being able to connect that to something I was passionate about before. And then it was very, very similar to Heather. I just read more about it, and you can read module descriptions and so on. And this module was actually the reason why I decided to do my Erasmus at the University of Dundee, because I was very excited about doing specifically this internship module. And it turned out to be very amazing, like I thought it would be. And it gave me a lot of practical input on how to do activism and how to do public communication about a topic one is very passionate about, but also a lot of insight into human rights issues that I didn't have previously, which was very valuable for me.
Oh, that's amazing. And just to give a clarity to our listeners, that Edzia and Lily both were in different years when they were pursuing this module particularly. And moving on, so what were your initial expectations when you joined this module, or I would say internship, how it was advertised, and how did it evolve over the period of your involvement with this module?
That's a very good question. I think my original idea going into this module was that it would give some practical input on how to work together with an NGO and how that looks, and also how to do productive activism that actually can create some positive change, and how to communicate with society and how to do that respectfully and constructively. And I think that changed in so far that I got more and more interested in the human rights aspects of it, which was something that had some things to do with the things I was interested in before. So I did a political science module, so I spent some time with thinking and learning about human rights issues, but not majorly. So this was actually something that came with the module as well, that I just noticed how interlinked some parts of politics and some parts of sustainability issues are with human rights issues, and how that all goes together. And I'm a very passionate educator. I do political education classes, and also just how to learn, how to communicate challenges, and how to enlighten a spark in people for human rights and for how a kind word can look was very influential, very much influenced by the module.
Yeah, I'm pleased to hear. I believe the module met your expectation as well.
It did very much.
What about you, Hedda?
I think I had my expectations that I was most excited about was definitely working with, I guess, other actors than just within a university setting, because that can be quite a secluded world. But through this module, we got to interact with other NGOs, other local newspapers, local politicians, just sort of learning how that gap is bridged in real life, with the successes and the failures that come with that. Because, of course, for every person who responded to us, a bunch of people just ignored us, which kind of made it all the more sweeter when we actually secured a meeting with someone. So learning how to do that in practice and improving that type of formal communication was fantastic for me.
Oh, perfect. And when you say NGOs, do you mean not-for-profit organizations? Am I right?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And just to gain clarity, so you did have assessments as a part of this module, or was it all practical based and only a behavior and participation was assessed?
That's a very interesting question, actually, because we were assessed. We were assessed, yes.
Okay.
And we also had to write some kind of I don't really know how to say that. We had to write a piece of paper in the end, not really an essay. It wasn't an essay. It was a reflective paper. And we also wrote piece of paper before we started our campaign where we kind of mapped out what we wanted to do. So strategy paper, and that was also part of our assessment. But yeah, part of it was also how we interact with each other, how we participate in the class. We were not directly assessed on the success of our campaigns.
Okay.
That was the one thing that basically was out of this assessment, because it's just very unsure, and in a lot of ways it's also not our fault if some things might fail, because there's a whole political landscape behind that. It's very hard to navigate if you're doing something for the first time, especially.
Oh, that's interesting that you're assessed based on your passion for involvement and being involved in this module. Is it possible for you to briefly explain how assessment worked in this module, and how was it different compared to other modules that you have taken? Like in traditional studies, we do a coursework, like you mentioned in this module, there was no coursework, there was a paper. So how did the assessment work in this module? At what stages or levels were you assessed?
So we had usually in university or in these kinds of topics, you're assessed through like critical analysis, which is the normal method. You take you have a problem, you look at what people have written about it, and then you compare them, you draw conclusions based on that. What we did in this module was reflective analysis. So
Okay.
it was a lot more about looking at the situation, what's happened, looking at what literature says about these types of issues. It could be group dynamics, stuff like that, and then see whether or not that actually applied to us. So it was a much more human-centered approach, I guess,
Okay.
or much more centered on ourselves, and being able to recognize our role in relation to what we were doing, rather than being an objective observer.
Oh, that's perfect. And so, how has this approach or personal learning experience influenced your learning and engagement with the material? Like you said, that grading was based on reflection and strategy planning rather than any traditional approach.
I think for me, it made me see myself as a professional working in that field. Because when you're a student, you're very often reading other people's work and comparing it to other people's work and to experiences you have not made yourself, because you have not worked in a professional setting yet. And this module gave you the possibility to actually be part of this work setting and then use literature practically and see if it applies to you, and also reflect on literature because of that. So for me, at least, it gave me a much more interesting and also more intense look on literature, because it was now
Okay.
something that applied to my situation instead of just something theoretical, which actually made me read things more deeply, because I could apply them to a situation I have been in now, and made me enjoy it a lot as well. I was really like thrilled by being able to read all of those examples and then see how my experience is interlinked with that. So that was something that definitely changed because of that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Heather, do you like to share anything from uh, how has your this approach influenced your learning or engagement with the material?
Sure. Yeah. I really agree with what Lily said. And on top of that, it's been a really good learning experience, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, about learning about myself. What are my strengths? What am I not very good at in the context of human rights advocacy? And trying to amend that, or like improve and learn, but not in a setting where you sort of have to perform at 100% all the time. There is a safety net in at uni in a different way. So it was a safer way to try trial and error and learn about these different things. Yeah, just not saying
Yeah.
that it doesn't matter what we did, of course, but just that it's someone else vetting it, and you're allowed to sort of need help in a different way.
Yeah. For clarity of understanding, is it possible for you to share an example of how a reflection or strategy you planned was assessed particularly?
So we had a few different topics that we were asked to reflect on. One which was case selection, for example. Um, we were split into groups of, my group was 5 people, And when looking at case selection, we had to reflect on why we think we picked that case. So what I thought at first was, ooh, maybe like one person is being a bit more domineering and stuff like that. But when I look back at it, I started to think about different theories and conceptualizations around power and what power structures in a small, like task-oriented group means. So when going backwards through that, I could kind of see that it wasn't that one person had inherently more power than another. It was rather that I perhaps didn't use mine as forcefully as I could have due to a bit of like awkwardness or shyness, frankly, in the beginning. So just seeing why I acted in a certain way, I think. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to gain some understanding. And is it possible for you to share any example or instance where you felt your advocacy work made a real life difference? And just to confirm, were you expected to make a real life difference, or is it just hypothetically you were made to get in yourself involved in some campaigns or some project works?
I think the question is, what is a real life difference? Because for a lot of human rights issues, we're not talking about getting a person out of prison or changing a complete political system just like through a student campaign. What we're talking about is getting some engagement on a specific topic and making people aware about a human rights issue that is happening and enabling people to reflect on that and maybe develop some political self-efficacy where they feel, okay, I am able to change something. And also there were campaigns in the past, for example, where there have been letters written to MPs, or we did a campaign based on social media and engagement around our campus. So we try to put more engagement into students that can then flourish there and develop further, all then connected to our case selection. So I think in a way we were expected to make an impact, but the impact is not getting a scholar that is in prison since years out of it, because much bigger organizations with much more staff had failed at that before, and that is a much more long-term thing. But giving either the scholar itself or the political structure in the country that we were, so in Scotland, or people surrounding us, some strength and some possibility, like some thought of possibility of change. And I think just from what I'm reading from people who have been in prison before, and also from people who have been in prison with the scholar that we advocated for, which is now free, by the way, which is very wonderful, that does a lot to the people who are in prison because they're not forgotten. And that can happen quickly. And if that does happen, then that influences the further life of them, much, much beyond what we can do and what like maybe larger scale things can do. So impact is it's not easy to measure when it comes to bigger things like this.
Yeah, when we're talking about real change, and majority of times campaign can sometimes result in very little visible change. So in these situations, how do you manage expectation or maintain motivation? Because as a student, when you're doing a project or something, you would need some kind of substantial impact, or you would want to see. When you see a little visible change, how did you keep yourself motivated, both of you?
I think for me, it was sort of knowing that when our internship ended, the advocacy for that particular scholar didn't. Because I knew that we took on after some other people had left off. I believe Lily and I actually advocated for the same person.
We did. And she was freed while you were doing your advocacy campaign, which was absolutely wonderful to hear, even though I had brilliant. It was not in connection. Obviously, the freeing itself was also not in connection to our campaign, but it had nothing to do anymore, but it wasn't lost.
Yeah. But it was also just like knowing that there is a continuation, I think. Because I looked at your work, like the group, the work that you and your group did, as inspiration for ours. So even though it was like different people, we knew that it was it continued on, and I think that's very motivating because then you want to leave something positive for the next person, right? You don't want the like nice trajectory to stop with you. So it's an expectation managing expectations by preparing the scene for the next advocate.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and thank you so much for sharing the information. And just to confirm, so because of your campaign, your participation, the person was actually released from the prison.
No, she was not released because of our campaign. Like I said, that was not
Okay,
in the scope of government. She was released
but you
during
contributed to
your
it.
campaign.
Okay,
Honestly, I do not think we changed the mind of a political leader. That is definitely
okay,
much more than you can give yourself credit for in any circumstance. No, I don't think so.
I think the role that the student advocates may have played throughout has been to keep each case relevant for
okay,
a long period of time, and not just
okay.
something that comes up whenever a
Yeah,
political organization feel like it. So
yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's the main thing,
yeah.
but
This gives
definitely
a lot
not.
of clarity. Absolutely. This gives a lot of
And for
clarity.
that also keep pressure high, because if there's constantly output, if there's constantly information, if there's constantly questions asked, things just don't start to fizzle away. Like, it's more about a continuous pressure that keeps up, which doesn't mean that that is not hard. There, at least from my experience, there have been situations where we had group conflicts because people had different ideas on how things should be going, and we did not make the progress we wanted to do. And that can have consequences for a campaign, but also for the people doing the campaign. So it's not to say that it's easy or that you just are
Yeah,
super fine with not seeing that anything changes when you put work into it. But I think like Hedda said, just like knowing that it will continue and that you just like one little drop in a big bucket, and at some time it hopefully is full and something will change. That's very nice and very rewarding. And I think a lot of activists see themselves as that, because
yeah,
you can't, like, one person can't change the world, but a lot of individuals can.
yeah,
And yeah.
absolutely. But even little contribution makes a lot of difference. So, and even during these campaigns, sometimes it could be really traumatic or emotional experiences. So, as a student activist, did you have any support systems in place by your tutors or university to help you deal with any potential trauma or emotional challenges during these campaigns where you were participating?
Yes, we did. Most of it was through getting knowledge, because it's for one obviously you're advocating for someone who's in a much worse situation that you can ever imagine. At least for me, that was the case. So it's very hard to not just see yourself as someone who shouldn't complain, because you're working towards something much more important. So getting information very early on that vicarious trauma is what it's called, when you experience trauma through the trauma of someone else, that is actually a thing
Yeah,
that exists and that it has an impact. And it's not just you not being strong enough or you just like should do your work better. That was actually very, very useful, because then, especially in the university structures, there are resources that you can use. So the biggest thing is getting information about the importance of mental health when it comes to that, because you can't activate, you can't do activism, and you can't do public engagement if you're burned out yourself. So yeah, I don't know. Do you think about anything else? But that was the most important thing for me, at least.
Yeah, I mean, we had an entire lecture dedicated to that, specifically focused on our mental health. In addition to that, there was also a sort of a security training, I believe is what they called it, which is on a bit more of a technical side, but I do think it's important to be brought up, which was more about how we should express ourselves online, what sort of internet protection we should apply when doing research and communicating. Um, so I think
and
that
during
that
these
was
projects,
really
were you working individually or were you part of a group working together so that you were like you were supporting each other as peers, or what did it make you involved only working individually particularly?
we were in a group. I believe the
Okay,
groups were
okay.
different sizes. Mine was 5 people.
We were 8, I think.
Oh, that's a big group. And I believe working in a group can be challenging, especially with members having diverse views and backgrounds. And is it possible for you to share any dynamics that you both have experienced in a group setting?
Yeah, of course. Um, it is quite interesting, because I think Heather, you and me had very different experiences, like you said. Um, I had quite a big group, which also changed in size during our campaigns. We started with a smaller group, and we made some basic decisions during that time, and that then members just entered our group afterwards, which was wonderful because we needed all the strength we need, like other people and all the voices and all the motivation that we could have. But it also meant that some decisions and some plans were already in action, which ended in some members not being felt very included, while other actors just wanted to continue going, and that ended in us having quite a bit of conflict in our group itself, especially since we were working on two different things at once. So we had this social media-based campaign and then like a poster and lecture-based campaign that we tried to just put together somehow, and that actually ended in our group deteriorating quite a bit. So we had phases in our group where our campaign stopped temporarily just to restructure and see how we can progress and how we can progress constructively, which is actually where Etzia, who you interviewed before, helped a lot, because she's a very skillful communicator, and she talks a lot about violence-free communication and like communication that just comes from yourself and doesn't put blame on others. So it's another thing that I especially learned through this module is how to communicate when there are great challenges and when you are working towards something that you're passionate about and that the other people are passionate about as well, but maybe in a different scale and in different points and for different reasons. And that is something that I think made me a better activist. It made me a better educator, and it made me just a better person in conflict, which is something that is so prevalent, especially when dealing with political situations and with situations that have some kind of importance to yourself. That's enough for a conflict. So I think that was actually, though it was a challenge and it was a struggle and it was quite hard at times, I think it was actually a great win, because I would have not made this experience of working through something like this without a situation happening. And that's like Hedda said before, you have a safety net, but you work professionally. So you can learn to address those things without being in a job setting where things have much bigger scales and you can't easily just turn to someone who maybe has an outside view on you as a group because you're just one group. So that helped a lot.
Thank you so much for sharing. So did this experience influence the way you collaborate and communicate with the team environment going forward in any project that you're involved in?
I don't know about any particular projects, but it has made me target applications a bit more, and what type of degree, what type of masters I'm interested in, what type of work I'm interested in, what type of position I would look for in a workplace, due to figuring out where I like to fit in this type of group. So that's definitely been a good thought exercise for me.
Yeah. And how was your experience of working in a group setting, Hedda?
Yeah, I think mine was a bit different, because we had, I was really pleased with my group in general. I felt like we didn't really have any big conflicts or anything. Obviously, that doesn't mean that everything would be problem-free. But I think for us, it came down to our lead, because we appointed a case manager at the beginning to sort of do most of the communication with Edzia and sort of organize everything. And in our group, she was really, really good. Just an incredibly organized person, and that helped a lot. So I think everyone sort of knew what they were meant to be doing, which reduced the amount of conflict a lot. On the other hand, that did put an unfair amount of pressure on that particular person, which in hindsight, I feel like we could have dealt with better, to spread that out a bit more equally. But that's also something that you learn, I think.
Yep, absolutely. I believe this module is still in progression. I believe the previous year's feedback would have helped the other years. I believe this would have been the outcome, because speaking with Edzia made me understand that she incorporates feedback actively. She did receive feedback from a previous year, which she was able to incorporate in the next year, that enhanced the student experience. So I'm pleased that it was incorporated and you had a good experience, Hedda, with student group dynamics. And I think, Lily, you mentioned about social media activism also. So that brings me to ask, what's your opinion on digital activism? Do you think digital activism is an effective measure as traditional methods? Or if you can enlighten us more, what is digital activism?
I think when you talk about what effect digital activism has, it depends on what kind of effect you want to achieve. Because it is much easier to have selectivism when you do digital activism. Selectivism is the act of doing like very small things like liking a post that don't really lead to big change. Because, for example, you're not signing the petition, you're not like sending a letter to the MP, you're just doing like the thing that's noticeable, that your friends can see online, that you can share with a colleague, like the kind of things that are very low effort, but because of that can not have to be, but can be very little result. But on the other hand, digital activism reaches much more people. If you're protesting in one city and you don't have any social media presence there or any online presence there, then your protest will stay in this city, or it might go to like the neighbor city, but it doesn't have much potential to go much further if there's no outside news that come in and talk about it. So you can give yourself your own platform digitally that you otherwise have to be given. So I think digital activism isn't better or worse than other activism. It is just a part of it, and it's a needed
Okay.
part because it can connect people, especially over platforms that are so safe to use that even people who live in countries and to do activism in countries where it's not safe to go out of the street and to protest or to sign a petition with your full name, you can still do something because you have secure and anonymous possibilities of doing activism. But I don't think it can just be one or the other. It
Okay.
does need.
So, as a part of this module, were you given experience with balance experience of both the approaches, digital activism as a way to even the normal activism, or was it your choice in regard to what you want to explore?
It was pretty much all of it was directed by us. So we
Okay.
could choose what type of activism we wanted to do. But I do believe that most groups incorporated some sort of social media aspect, just because it is almost impossible to avoid in the advocacy landscape. My group, for example, did split it sort of half and half through a social media campaign, which where we tried to collaborate with the different actors globally. And while we also did more local in-person events that specifically targeted the University of Dundee student community. And I liked that approach because it did kind of give you a bit of best of both. It was an opportunity to learn different approaches.
That's helpful. Thank you so much, Hedda. And now I would like to have the view of both of you in terms of how you view your role as a student activist. And for that, if possible, if you could, for our listeners, can you share what's the difference between student activism and student activism as pedagogical tool for human rights education?
I think activism as a pedagogical tool and student activism are two sides of maybe the same coin. So if you imagine activism just as like a thing that exists, you have students that do activism, you have students, you have people who do activism who aren't students, you have staff who do activism, and then you have this one part of it that is students who do activism as part of a module. And like Hedda already said, the biggest part of that is the guidance that you get. And right now, I'm not a student anymore, so I'm not doing student activism actively. I did student activism that wasn't supervised before. And while
Okay.
we had some kind of professional settings, we are aligned with an organization that is not student-based and that has people who work there and so on. It means that you have much less guidance and much less ability to reflect. So when you do student activism as a pedagogical tool, you're getting the pedagogical input. So you're getting input on what effectiveness specific strategies can have. You get input on how to structure an activistic platform. You get input on how to do activism without falling this trap of white saviorism and becoming the super cool person who just changes the world from their comfortable Western standpoint, which can happen. And you get a lot of input on how to navigate group dynamics, for example. And all of that is not something you easily have access to if you're just a student activist, which doesn't mean that
Yeah.
student activist campaigns without this pedagogical module aren't useful or effective. but it does help you a lot. And at least for me, like I said, I think it did make me a better activist outside of this university setting as well, and a better professional in general.
Thank you so much for explaining the difference. What's your view on this, Hedda?
Yeah, no, I agree with pretty much everything you said. The resources aspect is massive, both in information through lectures and stuff like that, but also in connections. Like we mentioned, EDSIA works with Scholars at Risk, an actual NGO, to make this module possible. So having access to all of their resources and previous advocacy and communications with them was really helpful to get on the right track. Additionally, when you have it as a class, it's not voluntary, because activism takes up a lot of time, and trying to do that, I can see you nodding, trying to do that outside of university when you already have a lot going on, you're stressed, you're preparing for your exams, it can be hard to methodically go through that with the attention to detail that it deserves. But since this was done in an educational setting, we had the time set for that. And I think that made it much easier to have a calmer approach and also to evaluate it a lot better afterwards.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think, Hedda, you mentioned that you had access to safety nets also. When you're making a real life difference in any campaign or you're contributing to it, how important do you think is having a safety net of guidance from educators in these situations?
I think it's critical to have some sort of guidance, because activism is collective effort, as an idea. And where that guidance come from can be a lot of different spaces. It can be from academia, which we could use here. It can also be from each other. Students come in with different experiences. Like we mentioned at the beginning, Lily had a lot more advocacy experience than I did. And we got to connect with other people globally who've been involved in Scholars at Risk, both former students and current students. So it's critical to have some sort of network and to continue to expand that as you go along.
I'd just like to add that Hedda had the knowledge about human rights that was missing for me. So this is actually a very perfect example, but a lot of those small examples in our groups where we were able to benefit a lot from each other.
And absolutely complement each other's skills as well. And how do you measure the impact of your advocacy efforts, particularly when immediate outcomes are not so apparent?
There are a lot of different. It's hard to measure, as we've established. Of course, there are some metrics that you can use. You can use numerical metrics such as amount of signatures, stuff like that. So we measured my group had 2 in-person events, one of which had quite a lot of engagement. I think it was about 100 signatures on a piece of paper, who we then engaged and talked to all of them. Whereas the other in-person event that we did had like 4 participants or something. So I think we used a numerical assessment basis on that because we reached more people. But otherwise, it is hard to know the long-term benefits when you're trying to evaluate it immediately. But there are always, it's sort of keeping up with the debate and seeing how that shifts, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
And for example, talking about selectivism, we had engagement on our posts. We had likes, we had views, we had people just engaging with that through that. But for example, on a lot of posts, we had quite a lot of likes and a lot of people seeing it, but we didn't have a lot of people writing in comments or messaging us directly or getting in contact with us, or even if we asked for questions and so on, there wasn't that much engagement on some of them. And on others, there were much less likes, but there were actually some kind of active engagement. So that's also a big thing. What is this passive engagement that you can just measure numerically? And what is the thing that sticks? Because the question is like, if you have 20 people who just like your post and scroll further and forget about it a minute later, or if you have like 3 people who actually interact with it, or if you scale it up, obviously it's like in hundreds and thousands, but it's not the amount of, that's not the sizes we were talking about when doing student activism on this scale. Smaller impact in numerics can be much more influential long-term, because people who actually take some time and thinking and interacting with that can then bring it to family friend structures, to other activistic platforms, to educational platforms that you just wouldn't bring something you liked on Instagram 2 weeks ago.
And when you were doing your assessments particularly, did you have to even justify what metrics you have been choosing as a group for your project, or did your academic staff or tutor pick on the metrics themselves?
Did.
Okay, that's helpful to know.
Yeah, we written them down. We had some goals before, we reflected on those goals. I don't know how it was for you, Hedda, but for us, we thought about beforehand what was realistic, and then we reflected on that and had it as part of our reflective paper in the end.
Yeah, we had a similar idea as well. But it also was interesting how the goals sort of changed throughout the process as we learned more and more about, it was a learning process throughout. And as we discovered more and more about how human rights works in practice, that sort of changed how we viewed our own role in it too.
That's helpful. And to give us more understanding, is it possible for you to walk us through what a typical day looks like for you when you are actively working on a campaign? So what are the most rewarding parts of these days, or even what are the most challenging aspects of when you're actively participating on a campaign?
For me, it sort of starts with some sort of group meeting so that everybody is on board and are working towards the same goal. Goal setting is critical. You need to know what you're working towards. Then we had, after we'd had like group meetings, we sort of went away and worked on our own individual parts. And then came back to see what we'd produced and tried to collectively put that together and then get it out into the world. And as for most rewarding, I think when we actually managed to like produce some sort of event or a physical campaign aspect. We had a table where we set up like a bunch of plants to try and get people in. So when people came up to look at the plants, and were interested in that, but then as we talked to them, it kind of shifted into a conversation about human rights, and they'd like forgotten the plant. So I think getting someone to actually be interested and have a dialogue is incredibly rewarding.
I agree. Even though we did social media activism as well, I totally agree. If you have people who get passionate about something that you're passionate about, and they're sharing that excitement and they're sharing that positive energy that you need, activism, Paulo Freire said, as activism needs to be done through love, needs to be done like lovingly and energetically and with trust, not naive, but like that is really, really wonderful. And then you just see how that's carried further, because like every now and then maybe some touch and so on. That's the coolest part, definitely.
And what are the most challenging aspects that you both have experienced?
I think for me, it is working in a group. I really like working in groups. I can think best in conversation. That's absolutely wonderful. But it means that you have a lot of individuals who have different ideas and different amounts of time and different thought process and different views of the world. And you have to come to a goal in the end. Because like Hedda said, that's the most important thing. You need to know what you're working towards. But if you have a room with 5 people, all 5 of them will have a slightly different idea of what the goal is in the end and the beginning. So it's navigating that, and then also actually having the men and women power to do something in the end as well. So I think having enough excited people that then kind of find a common idea of what change they want to make, that is really hard. I found it super hard in the group.
And I think for me, it was probably, there's two aspects, unpredictability and rejection. Because unlike an individual module, you're not solely responsible, not even the group is solely responsible for your successes or failures, since you are interacting with outside actors. If they don't respond, then there's not really anything you can do about that. Like if you're trying to contact, if you're contacting another organization, another NGO, and asking for them to collaborate on this really great idea or to share your social media campaign, and they say no, that's sort of, you have to constantly rethink your approach. And that happened to us a few times. So sort of being aware of that and not becoming like too downtrodden as a result, and to keep trying and changing up your tactics.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah, I think I think I agree with Heather there. Because I was just thinking, obviously group work is challenging, but that is also the thing that makes it so rewarding. It's absolutely wonderful to have this field of discussion where everyone is super energetic and really wants to do something, and then you just notice different perspectives. So actually, that can be challenging, but it's not negatively challenging. It's really positive.
Even challenges sometimes offer as opportunities.
Yeah,
as
but
well.
like not getting anywhere if you want to go to a specific direction because there's just no response. That's harder than a no, because you don't know if something will happen if you change something and then they come back to you later and so on. That's not that nice.
So overall, in what ways do you both think that participating in this human rights education through activism help you identify your strengths and weaknesses in work settings?
For me, it was the most influential module out of all of the ones I did at uni, without a doubt. And I think a big part of it was the group dynamics. I realized that I am not equipped to be like the leading figure in a group. I'm not equipped to be organizing it. Those aren't my strengths at all. Where I did realize was that I'm much better at like being a second in command person. I like coming up with different ideas. I like problem solving. So I realized that I like being a background figure more than a front figure, which has impacted this type of roles that I'm applying for different jobs and stuff like that. On top of that, it's also made me realize that advocacy is something that I could see myself continuing doing in the future. And like I've said multiple times, it has affected which masters I'm going for. The ones that I'm applied for have this distinct blend of theory and practice, which is a direct result of being happy with the way this one was structured.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for reflection. What about you, Lily?
I think it's quite similar in the starting point. For me, it definitely also gave me more information on what I'm good at. For me, that's very much being a communicative figure. I enjoy talking. I enjoy talking with others. I'm currently working in schools and doing political education there, which is wonderful and thrilling and amazing and exciting, and I love it very much. And I'm also working at uni, which is the same. And especially communicating with children and with younger people, for some reason, it helped me a lot doing that, because you do need this calm, violence-free, obviously, communication, calm, clear, also easy communication. If you want to do some kind of public engagement, it's always the best if you find the words that are just available to everyone who might want to look at it. So stepping away from this academic point of view, and from this very complex language that Leanne says exactly the same, that you could just say easier. That's something I noticed I'm actually quite good at, and I enjoy very, very much. So I totally agree. I totally agree with you, Heather. It influenced a lot on just me being more aware of my strengths, and it was the most rewarding and the most wonderful module I did my university degree as well. Even though I'm not will continue actively in my working life in human rights itself, I am definitely going to continue in activism and in political education and in working in this field. So that's.
And how do you see these skills benefiting you in the future, Lily?
I've worked as a journalist before. I could imagine doing that again at some point, and it definitely helped me being better at that, I think. I learned more about how to do public communication. And I'd also really very much want to stay in activism, in some kind of activist setting. And I think activism always sounds like people protesting on the streets, but it can be political education, it can be working in university setting, doing something like ETSI is doing, it can be just doing work in communities and doing like in changing, like actually talking to people in communities and figuring out needs and wants and then implementing that politically. And all of this, I think, I have a better overview now of what those things can be, and I figured out where I might fit in that. I could see myself very much continuing on this public relation path, and that's something that this module helped me a lot in just figuring out it closer. Yeah.
You can please to share that. I can see the passion in both of you. That's just coming in all the things that you're sharing about student activism in particularly. And so amazing to know that the impact it has had on your experience and even looking forward in the future as well. So with your participation with this module and overall with student activism, where do you see the future of student activism heading, especially in relation to educational institutions?
I think it's going to be more prevalent. Maybe it's hopeful, maybe it's wishful thinking, but since we're moving, just in general, we're moving towards a world where advanced skills outside of AI and digital context will really matter. So I think in order to keep up with that, in order for academia to keep up with that, there is a need to evolve. And I think moving past the sort of traditional just getting information spouted at you is a trend across education, different levels, different topics. So I don't see why developing human rights education in this manner would be any different, really. But maybe I'm just being a bit too optimistic.
I have a very two-sided view on that. On the one hand, I very much agree with Heather. I hope that there will be more modules like this and that there will be more participatory, active learnings in political engagement as in general, like learning to have this political self-efficacy where you feel like a citizen who can change society, that you're not like a passive part that goes voting every couple of years, but that you actually have the power and also that you're needed in making positive change. On the other hand, I hold it very highly that universities as institutions do not can decide what they're teaching and researching themselves. That's something I find very, very important. So I think having some kind of political voice over what and how it should be taught and researched in university can be very disbeneficial if political voices change and become extremist and become marginalizing to one specific group. So I think this has to be something that comes from the bottom. This has to be a bottom-up movement. This can't very much not be something that comes from university heads or comes from political sides. That would be damaging against the idea itself, because freedom of education is that's an important human right. It's super important that they exist. So I want that to happen, but I don't want to enforce it. So that's very interesting as a thought.
So what changes would you like to see in how institutions handle student activism?
Student activism itself is and was always part of university, and it's an important part of university. But I also do think that having those two sides is important. So obviously, I'd like university actors to interact with students and to hear their voices. But I think it is important to have these discussions and to have those two sides. So having people in university who might not be super fond of what you're doing and how you're doing it is an important part of the societal discussion. If that doesn't happen, if no one is critical about what people are doing with their voices, then you have like one line, and that's exactly what you don't want when you want to have political efficacy and like possibility of change in society. You need this conflict. So obviously I want to be heard. I have something to say. All student activists have something to say. But I think it's still important to have this discussion and to not just be like, oh, they should just like listen and do everything we want, but they should go into a critical and constructive discourse with people who are doing activism. Because most of the time, they're not doing it because they just had this random idea one day and they were like, oh, let me just spend most of my time doing that now. But they actually thought through it, they read through it, they spent some time researching, and they have some ideas of positive change.
Are there any changes you would like to see in institutions, how they handle student activism? Anything you would like to add, what Lily has said?
So yeah, just not to not be afraid, I think, because there is a lot of there are preconceived notions that I think that sort of top in many different institutions, both academic and non-academic, have about activism coming from bottom up, and feel like it's some sort of almost some sort of method of trying to topple their regime, to put it in very extreme terms. And then that just kind of leads to just shutting down, not wanting to listen. So not being afraid to engage with that and seeing student activism as something serious, rather like as a serious discussion rather than just noise-making peasantry that's coming to overthrow the king.
Yeah. We're nearly coming to a close. I've just got two questions from you. Firstly, I would like to ask this one. Looking back, how do you think your educational experience would have been differed without your involvement in activism?
First thing that comes to mind is that it would have been lonelier, and less rich because of all the discussions, because of all the people you were meeting. And I think it made me a more critical person, which I think is very important, but not critical in the way of I'm just going to criticize everything that comes towards me, but critical in the way of I have an opinion, I'm willing to discuss and reflect of it, and I'm willing to change it, but not because you say so. You have to give me something, and you have to discuss and engage with me, and I will listen to you, but you also have to listen to me. But yeah, a lot of it is also just meeting people and being in those discourse rooms where you can just change your opinion and you can change your views and you can like play with different thoughts of what might be your place in this world. And you can do that surrounded by people who are doing the same, which is absolutely wonderful. And that is I think the major thing that changed most of my life.
What about you, Hedda?
I think for me it would be one, I would feel probably a bit more lost in how I want to approach my future. It would also just be I don't know how to express it properly. I would feel less prepared to make informed decisions based on my own preferences and interests, because I don't think I would know them as well if I didn't have this experience. So yeah, I'd feel less prepared for the quote-unquote real world.
Thank you so much for sharing. Now that brings us to our last question. What advice would you give to students who are curious about but hesitant to get involved in activism?
I think I ask yourself what's making you hesitant? Because some reasons can be really good. Like that's not we can't forget that activism in different forms has can have a dangerous aspect to it. We were fortunate enough to be in Scotland and with a very supportive module convener. So it was never really, so like a safety aspect was never really in question for, at least for me personally. So to consider that and consider your own background, because the last thing you want to do is put yourself in a situation where you can get hurt. But if you don't have those fears, I would say go for it and like try, I guess. Because if you don't really have anything to lose with it, you might find yourself really enjoying it.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I would add, think about why you're doing it. As Hedda said, activism isn't noise. If you don't know, if you don't have something you care for, you can try finding something to care for. You can go to different meetings of activist group. You can read papers that are interesting that have nothing to do with university studies. That is completely fine. Like you are at uni, you have an entire library in front of you. Read something that has nothing to do with your subject. Maybe you enjoy it. or don't, I don't know. But like, just engage. I don't know, follow some political actors on social media platforms that you think you might enjoy. Listen to news podcasts, read different newspaper articles, like read the same newspaper article from 3 different newspapers and see if there's differences in framing things, and then try to find through that what your opinion is. And you don't have like, oh my god, that sounds like you need to have a finished opinion to do anything. That's obviously not true. But like, if you have anything you have a spark for, there will be people who have spark for it as well. And if you find them, then you're basically doing activism already, because you're connecting with other people, and you probably bring it to the world through that. So yeah, just I don't want to say just go for it, but like kind of just go for it. But base your activism on something. Like, go for it, but also read a book.
Thank you so much for such valuable advices. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Unfiltered by Empowered. A huge thank you to Lily and Hedda for joining us and sharing their valuable insights into the area of student activism. Thank you to also our listeners for tuning in. We hope this conversation inspires you to think about how you can pedagogically embed student activism at your own institution, and also insightful for students for taking student activism module if you have it available as an option at your institution. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay updated on all our latest episodes. Until next time, stay curious and empowered.